Some battles aren't fought with fists. They unfold in quiet rooms, behind closed doors. Harrison Ford had walked through storms before, but this one began in the unlikeliest place, a small-town police station on a rainy morning. 15 minutes later, that same station would stand frozen, its walls echoing with a lesson they'd never forget. But it all started with a shove, a smirk, and a door they should never have closed. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The rain came down in relentless silver sheets, turning the street outside the 14th District Police Station into a blur of gray water and flashing reflections from the occasional passing car. The morning air was heavy with the smell of wet asphalt, the kind that clings to you and seeps into your bones. Inside, the lobby was warm but stale, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, mixing with the low chatter of two uniformed officers leaning against the reception counter. They were laughing at something on a phone, the kind of laugh that's more about showing off than finding anything truly funny. Then the door opened with a low creak. Harrison Ford stepped in, each movement deliberate, as if he was in no rush to meet the eyes now turning toward him. His black coat was soaked, water streaking down in dark lines, the brim of a faded gray cap dripping steady rivulets to the tile. He carried nothing but a worn canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder, the kind that looked like it had been around the world more than once. The younger officer, barely past 25, didn't bother to look up at first. The older one, broad-shouldered with thinning hair and a jaw set in habitual boredom, let his eyes slide over Harrison with the kind of casual dismissal reserved for people you've already decided don't matter. Harrison's boots left damp prints on the tile as he crossed the empty space toward the counter. The older cop shifted his stance, planting an elbow on the desk, chewing slowly on a piece of gum as if to underline how little he cared. "Yeah," he said without warmth, "you lost something." Harrison's voice was low, even, carrying a weight that didn't match its volume. "I need to file a report. Urgent." The younger cop snorted, finally glancing up with a smirk that spread quick across his face. "Urgent, huh? You got an appointment?" Harrison shook his head once. "No." The gum clicked between the older man's teeth. "Uh-huh. And what's so urgent that you stroll in here like you own the place?" Harrison didn't flinch. Droplets slid from the brim of his cap, pattering softly onto the counter. "It's a matter of security." The younger cop leaned back in his chair, grinning at his partner. "Security? Hear that? Maybe we should roll out the red carpet." Their laughter was sharp in the quiet room, a sound meant to cut. The older cop took a slow step forward, closing the space just enough to make the encounter personal. "Look, pal," he said, tilting his head toward the door, "this isn't a lost and found. You want to waste someone's time, grab a number and sit down." Harrison's eyes lifted slightly, the shadow of his cap still hiding most of his face, but there was a stillness in the way he looked at them that didn't belong to a man used to being dismissed. "You misunderstand," he said quietly. "This isn't about me." The younger cop gave a little mock gasp. "Ooh, mysterious." He rolled the word out slow, savoring the mockery. The older man gave a short chuckle and stepped to the side, just enough to put himself squarely in Harrison's path to the counter. "How about you start with ID and a real reason to be in my lobby, and maybe I don't show you the door." The laugh lines around his eyes didn't match the threat in his tone. Harrison didn't move, he didn't raise his voice. "You'll want to let me file that report." It wasn't loud, but something in the way he said it made the words hang there a beat too long. The younger officer leaned forward, elbows on the desk, studying him like he was sizing up a stray dog that might bite or might run. "Is that so? And why is that?" Harrison's reply was steady, almost calm to the point of indifference. "Because you don't want to find out what happens if you don't." It wasn't bluster, and it wasn't a threat in the usual sense. It was something else, something quieter, sharper, that made the younger cop blink once before his grin returned. "Buddy," he said, "you have no idea where you are." Harrison's expression didn't change. His hand stayed loose at his sides, his boots firmly planted on the wet tile. The rain kept sliding off the brim of his cap, pooling slowly at his feet. And somewhere in that unshaken posture was the smallest suggestion that this man wasn't here to be told where he belonged. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with that faint, cold hum that makes a room feel more like a holding cell than place of help. The rain outside had softened to a distant hiss against the glass, muted now by thick walls and the stale air of the lobby. Somewhere behind the counter, the faint scratch of a pen moved across paper, steady and indifferent. A tinny stream of music leaked from the younger officer's phone, some half-hearted beat that didn't quite cover the sound of their low chuckles. Harrison Ford stood still in the center of the room, the weight of water in his coat dripping slowly onto the tile. He hadn't shifted his stance since walking in, and the silence between his words and theirs was starting to feel deliberate. The older cop stepped in close, a shadow stretching across Harrison's front as he leaned just enough to brush a shoulder against him. Not hard. Not enough to call it anything more than casual contact, but the smirk that followed made it clear it was meant to test him. Harrison didn't move. His head turned just slightly, enough for his eyes to sweep over the man's badge without lingering. A quick read, rank, name, years of habit in one glance. He didn't speak, didn't react, just let the moment hang. The younger cop noticed the lack of response and grinned, sliding his chair back from the desk with a scrape that cut across the quiet. He rose and circled, coming up on Harrison's other side, hands in his pockets like he had all the time in the world. "You hear, my partner?" he said, his voice oily with amusement. "He said you need an appointment." The older man gave a short laugh. Guess he didn't get the hint. Then the second shove came, not violent, but with a little more weight. A little more pressure through the shoulder, enough to feel the intent behind it. Harrison stayed planted, his boots gripping the slick tile. For half a heartbeat, he let the silence breathe, the sound of rain faint beyond the glass and the pens scratching in the background. Then his voice cut through, low and unshaken. "Touch me again," he said, "and you'll regret it." The words weren't a snarl. They weren't even loud. They landed like a warning dropped in still water, quiet, but certain to ripple outward. The younger cop tilted his head, pretending not to hear. "What's that?" His grin stretched wider, but something in his eyes flickered. The older officer shifted his stance, trying to read the man in front of him. Harrison's gaze moved between them, slow and deliberate, never rushing. It wasn't the look of a man intimidated. It was the look of someone taking stock, mapping exits, weighing options without a hint of hurry. The younger cop chuckled, but it was forced this time. "You threatening us, old man?" Harrison's expression didn't change. His hands stayed at his sides, fingers loose, his coat still dripping steadily onto the floor. The quiet between them thickened. The faint music from the phone suddenly too light, too thin to fill the space. The sound of a chair creaking in the far corner and the rhythmic tap of the pen seemed louder now, as if the whole room was leaning in to listen. The older cop finally gave a short scoff and stepped back, but not out of reach. "You better be careful with words like that," he said, trying to keep his tone level. Harrison didn't reply. He simply let his eyes pass over them one more time. A glance so steady it felt less like looking and more like measuring. He turned his head just enough to catch the reflection of both men in the rain-darkened glass of the door, the kind of glance that says the conversation isn't over. Outside, the rain kept falling, patient and steady, as if waiting for the moment it would be called back into the story. Inside, the air was no warmer, but it carried something new now, an edge neither of the two officers could quite name. The sense that they had just stepped into a game without knowing the rules. Harrison turned away from the counter without a word, his boots making a slow, deliberate rhythm against the tile. The sound seemed to carry in the near-empty station, each step echoing faintly under the hum of the fluorescent lights. He moved toward the long hallway that led to the exit, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged. Near the far wall, a janitor paused mid-swipe, mop dripping into the bucket, eyes quietly following the man in the dark coat. There was something in the way Harrison walked, steady, unbothered, that made you look twice without knowing why. The laughter from behind him chased after his steps, low and smug, like a private victory being savored. The younger officer muttered something under his breath, earning another chuckle from his partner. They spoke as if the man they had dismissed was already forgotten, as if they had proved a point only they understood. Harrison didn't look back. Outside the front doors, the rain was still falling, though softer now, the steady hiss broken only by the occasional gust. Then the light in the lobby shifted, dimming for just a second as if a shadow had passed over it. A sweep of pale gold slid across the frosted glass of the entrance, headlights moving slow. The faint growl of engines filtered in, deep and measured, not the hurried sound of passing car, but the kind of approach that carried weight. It blended with the rain at first. Background hum almost too subtle to notice, but it was there, steady, drawing closer. Harrison reached the end of the hallway and stopped just short of the door, the glow from outside tracing the brim of his cap. He didn't move immediately. He just stood there, listening, the faintest turn of his head suggesting he'd already measured the distance of those engines in his mind. Behind him, the conversation at the counter carried on. The older cop was recounting the exchange, exaggerating Harrison's words to get another laugh out of his partner. Their voices were easy, relaxed, as if the tension from a moment ago had already drained away. The janitor still hadn't moved, mop poised in the air, gaze fixed somewhere between Harrison's back and the shifting shadows beyond the glass. Another sweep of headlights passed, closer this time, the light sliding along the wet floor just inside the doorway. The rumble of engines settled low in the chest, felt more than heard. Harrison's boots stayed planted, his shoulders squared to the rain-smeared glass, the line of his body unchanging. The younger cop called out to him, voice carrying down the hallway, something about forgetting to leave his pride behind. Harrison didn't answer. The janitor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in quiet recognition of a moment about to turn. Outside, the light shifted again, as if more than one vehicle had now taken position. The sound of the engines deepened. Their rhythm too controlled, too precise to belong to anything casual. In the lobby, the two officers kept talking, their attention fixed on their own version of events, their own sense of control. But the air was changing. You could feel it in the way the rain seemed to pause between gusts, in the way the hum of the lights seemed louder for just a moment. Harrison reached for the handle but didn't pull it open. Instead, he let his hand rest there, eyes still on the distorted shapes moving in the rain beyond. The janitor's grip tightened on the mop handle. Whatever was outside was close now, and whatever it wasn't coming by accident. Outside, the rain parted around the hulking shapes of three black SUVs gliding to the curb with mechanical precision. Their bodies gleamed under the street lamps, each movement measured, deliberate. Engines idled in a low, steady growl that seemed to vibrate through the pavement. Doors stayed shut. Windows tinted dark as obsidian reflected nothing but streaks of water and fractured light. In the hallway, Harrison's eyes stayed fixed on them. He didn't shift, didn't react. Inside the lobby, the younger cop leaned against the counter, still grinning, oblivious to the shift in the air. The older one was halfway through a sarcastic retelling when the first SUV's engine revved just enough to cut through the rain. Then the station door burst open with a force that made the hinges groan. Cold air and the smell of wet asphalt swept inside as a tall man in a dark, tailored coat strode through without hesitation. His reins slicker clung to his shoulders, beads of water running down in sharp lines. He hadn't bothered to remove it. His presence hit the room like a slap of authority. Silver hair slicked back, eyes sharp and unblinking, a badge clipped to his lapel that caught the fluorescent light. His gaze swept the room in a single pass before locking on the counter. "Where is he?" His voice was not raised, but it carried with the precision of an order that had been followed 1,000 times before. The receptionist blinked, startled. "Sir, the man you just sent out into the rain." The younger cop straightened, his smirk faltering. "You mean the guy who—" The man's eyes cut to him like a blade. "Yes, that man, where is he?" The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "He was heading out," he said, the words dragging like they weighed too much. The newcomer stepped closer, water dripping from the hem of his coat onto the floor, each drop sounding louder than it should. "Why, what happened here?" Neither cop answered quickly. The younger one swallowed, glancing at his partner as if hoping for a cue. "He didn't have ID," the older officer said finally, but it came out weak, defensive. The man in the coat stared at them both for a long moment, and the room seemed to tighten around the silence. Then he spoke, each word deliberate. "Do you have any idea who you just threw out?" His tone wasn't angry in the way most people shout. It was controlled, edged with something sharper, professional disappointment with teeth. The younger cop's throat bobbed. "Some older guy," he tried, but the words died under the weight of the stare fixed on him. The man in the coat took a slow step forward. "That older guy is Harrison Ford, Federal Strategic Advisor, highest-level clearance this side of the Pentagon. He's the only civilian with unrestricted access to certain joint response protocols. He answers to one person in this country, and it's not you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the music from the younger cop's phone had stopped. Somewhere behind them, the janitor stood frozen, mop still in hand. The older officer shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly aware of every shove, every mocking word from minutes ago. Outside, the SUVs kept their engines running, their presence as steady as a heartbeat. The man in the coat, clearly someone with command in his veins, looked past the two cops toward the hallway. "Bring him back," he ordered. And it was clear he wasn't asking. Neither officer moved immediately. The younger one looked toward the door, then back at his superior. "Sir, he's right there." The man turned. Harrison was still standing just inside the glass doors, his coat dripping, his cap low over his eyes. He hadn't said a word through the entire exchange. For a moment, no one did. The only sounds were the hum of the lights and the deep purr of the engines outside, waiting. The balance in the room had shifted in an instant. Those who thought they held it were suddenly scrambling to find their footing, and the man who'd been dismissed as nothing had just become the center of gravity. The air inside the station felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves had drawn in closer. The tall man in the dark coat didn't move from where he stood, but the weight of his presence seemed to press against everyone in the lobby. His eyes stayed locked on the two officers, his voice even but cold enough to cut. "Do you understand what you've done?" The younger cop opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure if any answer would be safe. The older one tried to hold his ground, but his jaw was tight, his voice thin. "We didn't know who he was." The man's reply came without hesitation. "That's the point. You didn't ask, you didn't look, you didn't think." He stepped forward, water still dripping from his rain-slick coat onto the tile. "Harrison Ford," he said, letting the name hang in the air for a beat, Federal Strategic Advisor, Level Omega clearance. The only civilian authorized to coordinate between federal, military, and intelligence assets without a chain of command delay. His gaze shifted between them, sharp enough to strip away any defense. "The man has sat in classified briefings you'll never hear about, advised on operations you'll never read about, and while you were smirking behind your desk, he's been in helicopters over disaster zones, pulling strangers out of places no sane pilot would land." The younger officer blinked, the words sliding in slow, their meaning landing harder with each example. The older cop's eyes dropped for the first time. The man's tone didn't change, but the weight of it deepened. In 1998, he landed on a mountainside in Wyoming to lift a hiker with a fractured spine. In 2000, he pulled a dehydrated child from the desert floor in Idaho. Those weren't jobs. They weren't headlines. They were lives saved because he didn't waste a second. He let the silence after that line stretch, the point pressing in like a held breath. Then came the knife. "And you just wasted 15 minutes. The words were quiet, but they landed like a gavel. 15 minutes, he repeated. Enough time for a device to change hands, for a convoy to vanish, for a city to go dark. The younger cop shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado evaporating. The older one swallowed hard, the sound audible in the stillness. Harrison hadn't moved, still framed in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat to the floor. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but the calm in his stance only made the truth sharper. The man in the coat stepped back just slightly, not as retreat but as punctuation. "He is here on an operation you can't begin to understand, and every second you kept him from doing his job was a second someone else was in danger." No one in the lobby moved. Even the receptionist's hands had stilled above the keyboard. The janitor stood frozen, mop still in hand, as if the moment itself had locked the room in place. The younger cop's lips parted, but no words came. His partner glanced toward the hallway where Harrison stood, a flicker of something close to shame in his eyes. The man in the coat didn't wait for excuses. He turned slightly, addressing Harrison now. "Sir, the conference room is secure. Washington is on standby. They've been waiting for you." Harrison stepped forward, the sound of his boots on the tile breaking the silence like a slow drumbeat. He passed the two officers without a glance, but the space between them seemed to shrink under the gravity he carried. As he moved down the hall with the man in the coat beside him, the younger cop finally exhaled, a shaky, uneven sound. The older one didn't move at all, his gaze fixed on the wet footprints trailing across the floor, each one a reminder of a moment they would never undo. Outside, the SUVs still waited, engines steady, as if they too knew the cost of lost time. The conference room door closed with a soft hydraulic hiss, sealing out the noise of the station. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of electronics and the steady hum of servers embedded along the walls. A single oval table dominated the center, its dark surface scattered with folders stamped TOP Secret in red, a secure comms unit blinking green at one end. Along the far wall, a bank of screens glowed with satellite imagery, heat maps, and scrolling lines of encrypted data. In the largest frame, a live video feed connected directly to Washington. Harrison Ford walked in without a word, the canvas messenger bag still slung over his shoulder, droplets of rain darkening the fabric. The man in the dark coat, Chief Anderson, gestured to a chair near the head of the table. "Sir, we're live with the Pentagon and Homeland Security." Harrison set the bag down with deliberate care, his eyes sweeping the room once before he took his seat. The faces on the screens shifted slightly as the feed adjusted. On the left, a Pentagon official in uniform, his chest lined with medals. In the center, a Homeland Security director with the pinched look of someone running on no sleep. On the right, a man whose name never appeared in public records, his face calm but eyes sharp. Harrison unzipped the bag and pulled out a black case no bigger than a hardcover book. The metal caught the light for just a second before he set it down in front of him. "Every second we lose," he said, his voice low, steady, "is one step closer to them." His hand rested on the case for a moment before flipping it open. Inside, cushioned by foam, was a sleek device humming faintly with blue light at its core. "Quantum cipher core," Harrison said. "It's designed to override and collapse entire defense grids. Command systems, drone fleets. Nuclear launch protocols, gone in seconds. No recovery, no fail-safe." The Pentagon official's jaw tightened. The Homeland Director leaned in, studying the glow. "How did it end up here?" Harrison's gaze didn't leave the device. "A leak in the city. Someone with access sold intel to a foreign network. This precinct was the last drop point flagged by the algorithm. I came to confirm the handoff before the window closed." He glanced toward Anderson. "But I was delayed." The word hung there, heavier than it should have been. Anderson's eyes flicked toward the memory of two uniformed men outside, but he didn't speak. 15 minutes, Harrison continued, locking eyes with the faces on the screen. "That's what was lost. In that time, the buyer could have moved the core, encrypted their own systems, and vanished into another jurisdiction. If that had happened by the time you traced it, entire sectors could already be dark." The man in the right frame finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "Do we still have a shot?" Harrison closed the case with a decisive snap. "Yes. But the trail is cooling. They're moving now." The Homeland Director exhaled slowly. "What's your recommendation?" Harrison's tone didn't shift. "Full autonomy, immediate deployment of Spectre team, and I want uplink access to the strike net." The Pentagon official hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Granted." The man in the right frame leaned forward. "You have what you need, Ford. Make it happen." Harrison nodded once, the faintest acknowledgement, and slid the case to the center of the table. Anderson signaled to an aide, who began prepping the encrypted channel. The room seemed to vibrate with purpose now, the earlier delay still casting a shadow over every second. Harrison's eyes shifted briefly to Anderson. "Next time, no checkpoints, no questions. You see my name, you open the door." Anderson gave a tight nod. "Understood." Harrison stood, slipping the messenger bag back over his shoulder. "We have one chance to shut this down before it spreads," he said, already moving toward the door. "And if we miss it, there's no getting it back." No one in the room questioned him. Outside, beyond the sealed walls, the engines of the waiting SUVs rumbled steady, as if the mission had already begun. The screens behind him shifted to live feeds of city blocks, infrared outlines of moving vehicles, and the clock in the corner ticked forward. Each second now marked not by sound, but by the unspoken truth that the margin for error had been erased. The conference room door opened, and Harrison stepped out, the low murmur of voices behind him fading as the seal closed again. His coat was still damp from earlier, the dark fabric carrying the faint sheen of rainwater under the lobby lights. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs filled the space, but it wasn't enough to drown the sound of the storm beyond the glass doors. Each step he took toward the counter echoed in the room's uneasy silence. The two officers straightened instinctively. Though neither spoke, Harrison stopped in front of them, close enough for them to see the small flecks of water clinging to the brim of his cap, close enough for them to feel the stillness he carried. He didn't speak right away. The pause stretched, long enough for the sound of the rain to grow louder in their ears, long enough for them to feel the weight of being looked at without a single word. When he did speak, his voice was low and deliberate, each word landing with measured precision. "Your job," he said, "is to look closely, listen carefully, before you open your mouth." The younger cop swallowed hard, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a tightness around the eyes. The older one shifted his weight, his hands restless at his sides. Harrison's gaze didn't waver. "Today you didn't do that. You didn't ask the right questions. You didn't even try. You judged by a coat, by silence, by what you thought you knew." The words weren't shouted, but they carried more force than if they had been. "That's not just bad policing," he continued. "It's dangerous. Because one day the person standing in front of you might be the only thing between this city and chaos." The younger officer's eyes flicked toward the floor. The older one held his gaze a moment longer before looking away. Harrison stepped half a pace closer, closing the gap until the faint scent of rain on his coat cut through the sterile air. "Remember this moment," he said. "Remember how small it feels. And remember that real strength doesn't come from the badge. It comes from knowing when to shut up and listen." The rain beyond the glass roared against the building, a steady backdrop to the quiet in the room. Harrison let the silence sit for another beat, letting the words settle in a way that would outlast the day. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned away, his boots carrying him toward the door. Behind him, neither man moved. They stood rooted in place, the weight of his voice still pressing on them, the lesson clear in a way that needed no further explanation. This wasn't about embarrassment anymore. It was about the kind of mistake that could never be allowed to happen again. Harrison reached the glass doors without hurry, the storm outside casting rippling shadows across his coat. He paused just long enough to adjust the brim of his faded cap, the motion unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. His hand brushed the worn strap of the messenger bag at his side, a small, familiar gesture that carried more weight than any display of force. Beyond the glass, the black SUVs waited in a tight formation, engines idling with a low, restrained growl. One rear door swung open in silent invitation, the interior light spilling a pale glow onto the wet pavement. Harrison stepped out into the rain, the sound of it rushing around him, soaking the shoulders of his coat. Darkening the brim of his cap, the water beaded on the worn fabric, running in thin rivulets toward the ground. He reached the first SUV and set a hand on the open door, then stopped. Slowly, he turned his head back toward the station. The two officers were still standing near the counter, stiff, their faces unreadable but pale under the harsh lobby lights. The glass between them blurred the details, but not the intent in his gaze. His voice carried easily over the rain, low but sharp enough to cut through the distance. "Regret is a heavy thing to carry," he said. "Don't pick it up twice." He didn't wait for a reaction. The words hung in the damp air like a final verdict. Harrison ducked into the SUV, the door closing with a quiet, solid click. The convoy moved almost instantly, pulling away from the curb in seamless unison. Water sprayed from the tires, the red glow of taillights bleeding into the curtain of rain until both were swallowed by the storm. Inside the station, the two men stood frozen, the echo of his voice settling into a silence that felt deeper than the one before. Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the street lamps, an operation had already begun, and Harrison Ford was moving toward it, not as a man to be recognized, but as a presence felt in the space between action and consequence. In a world where seconds mattered and the cost of hesitation could never be paid back. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.